This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so welcome everybody, and I'm sure others will arrive over the next few minutes. Thank you for joining us for the April CPSG webinar, and I'm delighted to be able to have the excuse to bring a good friend and colleague, Dr. Simon Black, in to talk today on the development, I suppose, and the application, the origination and application of a model to help us to not only look at projects in terms of what success that they are achieving, but then to be able to link that success or track back connections from that success to the internal functioning of the project, from leadership through to resource allocation, etc., etc. Say Simon, he'll introduce it better than I, but did an amazing job sort of drawing from the business sector, and he's a great example of where I think we sort of an illustration of the interdisciplinarity that conservation biology should demonstrate, although I think it does it in a fairly limited way in many situations, but where we can kind of cross-pollinate ideas and tools and skills and adapt them to suit our needs. And so Simon is going to talk to you today about the model, not take you into the nitty gritty nuts and bolts of it, but give you an overview of its application and value. And hopefully it will be a springboard into both discussion here, but may also be opportunities for connecting afterwards as well. So if I could ask everybody to mute your microphones if you're not Simon, that would be great. And in terms of commenting or questions, if I could ask that during the presentation you use the chat, and you'll see it on the top right hand corner, there's the speech bubble. If you just click on that, then you can add your comment or question in, and Simon would be very relaxed about it, and when it seems appropriate, I will interrupt him and pose that question or ask what you've written, but we'll also save some time back at the end for a chance for more open discussion once you've also heard what Simon has to say. So on that note, Simon, if I can hand over to you to introduce yourself much more richly than I have, and then go into the presentation.
Thanks very much, Jamie. Thanks for your welcome, and thank you everyone for coming along to the session. It's a pleasure to have an opportunity to share with a very mixed group the background on this particular model. So I'll be talking about evaluating project effectiveness, and then specifically focusing on the conservation excellence model. To give you a bit of a background about me, I'm a member of DICE at the University of Kent, and I've been there for about 12 years or so. And prior to getting involved in the conservation sector, I worked for a couple of decades in various other commercial and industrial organisations, and learnt a lot about how things tick. And when the opportunity came for me to move more into wildlife conservation, and start pursuing not only consultancy support in that sector, but also developing research to learn more about how to do conservation better, then I was able to draw on some of those experiences that I've had in other areas of life, and then bring them into the conservation field. And some of the experiences and observations we have day to day ourselves in our own projects, in our own jobs, are things that are often reflected in human beings working in completely other activities. So there's a lot of learning to share there, and I think that as a sector we're on quite an interesting pathway in terms of the challenge we've got to improve our effectiveness, but also the opportunity we have to increase our capacity. So I'll give a very sort of broad overview of this particular topic, and as Jamie said, if there are questions along the way we want to bring up, we can weave our way through those and then hopefully pick up any loose ends towards the end. Well, I'll take myself off camera so you don't just have me gabbing at you, and you can focus on the content. I've kept the slides fairly simple so that hopefully they're reasonably straightforward to follow, if sometimes a little bit unattractive, straightforward to follow on the screen. So the work I've been involved in DICE is sort of drawn on, as I said, experiences in other sectors, and a lot of the important learning around management and organisation has occurred really since the 1970s, 80s onwards, and we're in a fortunate position where we can kind of exploit that learning and then use it to get the right sorts of insights in how we manage conservation projects. So that's kind of the thinking behind the session, and hopefully you'll get a steer on what the conservation excellence model is as we go through. So what I'll do, and this is outlined in the joining materials, is give just a brief intro to project evaluation, talk about the conservation excellence model specifically, and then give some examples of large and small projects that have been evaluated using this model. And from that, start to get a sense of why assessing the activities, functions, processes of an organisation, as well as just the results and outcomes. And from that, hopefully you'll see how the particular focus of CEM evaluation drives improvement and how that can help with project planning, and hopefully drive some improved impact of conservation on the ground. So I've divided this up into sort of 5 sessions. So as we progress through, you'll see these big highlight topics. So principles of evaluation, the CEM itself, the value of assessing operations and functions, the value of learning, and how conservation excellence model can support improved planning. So the sort of lessons that we've got from the process. Okay, can we all hear everyone okay? Is that all right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Simon, is that noise coming from your side or?
No, it's not. It's
okay,
from someone else's mic, I think.
Excellent. Yeah, if you can mute, that's great. Thank you. Carry on.
Lovely, thanks for that. Right, so I thought what I'd kick off with is some reflection really on some surprising management principles. And in some ways they're surprising, some ways they're not, but they're things we sometimes don't talk about. But it shapes how we need to think about managing and improving and evaluating projects. First one is that conservation management deals with systemic issues and not linear cause and effect. And what we mean by that is, we work in complex ecosystems, we work in complex social systems, we work in economic and legal systems. And the way that we need to manage is understanding systems. It's not just we do this work, we get that outcome. And we've got to kind of reflect that in the way we manage it. But of course, most people haven't been trained in managing systems. They've been trained in just kind of functional management or hierarchical management. And that can cause a problem, as we'll see a little bit later on. But it's important to understand that. What we're trying to do with evaluation is make sure that projects are set up and improving so that they can perform in the systems that are important to them. Second thing is that project management is generally about protocols and procedure, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the challenges of conservation, because project management protocols are about delivering a product in a time period. And of course, in conservation, we're not generally dealing with physical products. Okay, there will be sub-projects where we're building a facility or a road or a fence or something like that, but the general outcomes from conservation aren't about physical products. So straight away, we've got kind of a mismatch there in terms of what we might be looking at. The second thing is that project time boundaries are obviously human related. So they're based on the way that we look at the world, we look at time, and we look at our constraints. And obviously, a short-term project generally doesn't fit with the requirements of long-term ecological recovery. So straight away, there's a little bit of a mismatch there as well. And obviously the time constraints we generally work with are those around natural systems. So although we might have human pressures in terms of budgets and funding deadlines and so on, the work is going to be driven around life history of the organisms we're working with, their ecology, seasonality, and so on. Now we do know that in conservation, typical problems, and I'm kind of quoting one of my earlier papers here with Carl Jones and Jim Groombridge, where we identify that typical problems where conservation projects had failed or suffered major difficulty was not because of biological issues, but it was because of human issues around organisation, and we'll look at that a little bit later on. But we know from management theory and from the experience of other organisations in other sectors that where we see problems with human beings causing the problem, that's not necessarily about just painful people, difficult people. It's actually because of the design of the organisation, the system as we call it, the design of the organisation. And this means that we need to kind of take all of these elements into account when we're going to look at the effectiveness of conservation and how we're evaluating it. So just a brief overview. Here are the 10 common problems in species conservation programs. You can look these up later, but the encouraging thing is that in the sort of yellow ovals there, I've kind of highlighted the things where I think conservation is starting to recognise that we've got an issue and starting to make progress. So we're much better now about thinking about goals in terms of project design and planning. I think we're much better as organisations about sharing information. And to some degree, we're getting better at understanding different methods, different approaches, and what preferences might be driven by the systems we're looking at rather than our own professional pride, if you like. And I also think we're starting to creak the door open on learning from failure as well. But there's still some way to go. And that said, the items that are underlined in red there are ones which I think we've still got very fundamental problems with in many areas of work and organisation. Bureaucratic structures, poor decision making, the stifling of innovation, and very rigid people management. So there's plenty still that we need to learn about. So let's think about project evaluation. I'll try and sort of kind of knock on the door a little bit in terms of your thinking, just to kind of get you into where I'm coming from with this methodology. So obvious principles of evaluation around knowing why actually we need to evaluate. Why do we need to assess a project? Why do we need to assess what's going on? Second is around what should we evaluate? And the third bit is around how we should do that evaluation. And if we don't get all of those elements right, then we might not get an outcome that's particularly helpful. So typically, the reasons we do evaluation are these sorts of things, and they're quite important to consider. Firstly, we want to evaluate the achievement of aims or the achievement of purpose of the project. We want to evaluate biodiversity outcomes, obviously. We want to know whether objectives are being achieved or whether tasks are being completed. And often we're interested in value for money. So is there actually efficient activity going on? But I think also we need to be honest, and sometimes we just do an evaluation because we need to do an evaluation. It's a requirement of funding, or we need to be seen to be doing the right thing. So those sort of very commonly encountered reasons for doing the evaluation. But I'd suggest we need to think about these from slightly different perspectives. So I think in terms of purpose, what we really need to understand when we're evaluating is, do we understand the true purpose of the program or the project that we're undertaking? Do we know that the change in biodiversity status, including reduction of threats, but that change in biodiversity status is actually linked to the work of the project? Are the goals that have been set, the priorities that have been set, actually relevant? is the work that's being done relevant? And is the investment being made, does it actually fit the purpose of the program, and is it therefore being effectively used? And ultimately, the purpose of the evaluation is to learn and to improve. So this might be sort of stating the obvious, but we need to kind of get into this mode of thinking seriously about the way we go about doing evaluation, because otherwise we're going to miss the trick. This is particularly because there are a number of difficulties associated with evaluation. When to assess it? Do we assess before the project, during the project, after the project, or all three? We know that projects can be very complex. They can be in difficult landscapes. They can be dealing with species that we might never see. We might have a whole mix and range of different stakeholders. There might be multiple threats or emerging accelerating threats as well. We'll need to use mixed methods of assessment, quite possibly, and that drives loads and loads of data. So we need to know, are we assessing the right things when we're doing the assessment? And are we interested in what is recorded by the project? What the project says it's doing, what we actually see is going on, or what actually occurs in the project. And those, depending on how you do your assessment, you can kind of get a mix of those or a bias towards one of those. And obviously we're interested in what's really occurring. And can we overcome the sort of self-defeating self-interest? In other words, people's wanting to protect themselves. So if a project wants to protect itself and hide stuff, how do we have an evaluation that kind of works its way around that without hurting people, but enabling them to get to the truth and really learn what's important, what needs to be improved? So we've got to kind of overcome this blame versus learning sort of dichotomy. We could have a tick box approach, and I've seen these in other evaluation tools, but they're generally unhelpful because they're quite linear. So you end up with very, very long tick boxes, and people kind of lose track of where they're going in terms of the learning and what needs to be changed or improved. We can struggle with assessor bias. We can struggle with the amount of time that's taken or the resources that are required for evaluation. Of course, you don't want an evaluation process that takes up too much resources. You want one to be useful. So from my perspective, the sort of rationale behind assessment is a combination of these things here on this slide. So firstly, that you assess the whole system. You look at the organisation, you look at the project and how it's organised, but you also look at how that fits in the wider social structures, and obviously the ecology, the landscapes, and any other elements of the natural world that feature in that, including time. You need to look at organisational issues, and you need to understand how the actual makings and mechanics of the organisation influence the outcomes that we want for biodiversity, and see if there are any problems or opportunities there. You need to think about past, present, future over time, because we're interested in not only is this project okay today, but is it sustainable, or will the results that it delivers be sustainable in the future? Because that's about us being responsible with the way we're going about our business. We need to make it a learning process, so that means doing an evaluation that actually has the people in the project getting alongside, involved in it, getting some ownership of it, feeling that it's a positive process, and they want to kind of take that learning on board and take it forward after the evaluation has ended. The method needs to be systematic, it needs to be repeatable, that people feel it's reliable. They also want to know it's objective, and this is quite a tricky thing. So how do we get that? And with the CEM, we involve a number of people looking at the project, so we get different perspectives, which gives some sense of combining what would be subjectivity into a much more objective view of what's going on in the organisation, a realistic sense of reality, a realistic view of the organisation or the project. And obviously we want to do all of this as quickly and as efficiently as we reasonably can. So I'll take you through the conservation excellence model very briefly, and as Jamie said, it's only going to be a quick taster. The training for this is fairly extensive and requires other sort of background learning that people will have to be able to understand it best. But that said, the sort of logic of it hopefully will make sort of fairly straightforward sense to you as I walk you through it. So the model itself has been wholly adapted for conservation. So it's drawn on experiences from evaluation models used in commercial, public, industrial organisations across the world. There's a number of key models that have informed the Conservation Excellence Model. One is the European Foundation for Quality Management model, which is used in Europe, but it's also used in Asia and in Australia and in South America. The Baldrige model, which is largely used in North America, particularly for the USA, but elsewhere in North America as well. And then there's the Deming Prize, which is a model used in Japan. So the Conservation Excellence Model draws from those, but also builds on other management theory to make sure that what we're doing when we're doing an evaluation doesn't become a difficult sort of audit, if you like, a difficult examination for a project that would stifle learning. But rather than that, it's a much more sort of organic process that gets alongside people working in your project and enables them to sort of open up and really pick into the issues that might be helping them or hindering them from doing good conservation. So here's the model. It's a 9-box model which summarises the key criteria, the things that we look at when we do an evaluation of a project or an organisation. And I should emphasise kind of 2 things. The first one is that the focus of this model is on species and ecosystems. So there, if you like, to kind of use commercial thinking, they're, if you like, the customers of this process. You know, is the project delivering for the species and ecosystems of concern? And if you think about human communities that live in landscapes which are under pressure, then we'd also take account of their needs within that landscape. So it does also take account of people in the landscape. And obviously it also includes any elements of threat that come into that as well. So we're taking account of the natural system, but also fitting that into wider systems of society, of politics, economics, and so on. So there are 2 sort of aspects of the model. On the right-hand side, in light grey, we have the results. So these are the key areas of results, which should indicate whether a project or a program is being successful or not. And they're kind of split into the biodiversity results, which are things about the natural world, basically what species and ecosystems worry about. And then at the end there's conservation program results, which are the things that human beings worry about, which is, money, finance, resources, progress, milestones, goals, that sort of thing. And then we're also interested in the views of people working in the project, which might be staff, or it might be local volunteers and community members who are involved. And we're also interested in the wider society that's sort of more distant from the project and how much support it has for the work that's being done. So those are all the areas of results that we look at. And we're also interested on the other side in the approach, the processes, the activities. These are often called enablers, the things that are done to deliver your results. And the big sort of black box in the middle there, the core conservation processes, is the core work of your project. But the other hard elements are sort of policy and strategy, management of resources and finance. They're in the black there, and then the 2 white boxes, the sort of softer elements, as we sometimes think about it. The leadership, the people management, the community engagement, that sort of side of things. And you'll see all of the boxes are linked together, and also importantly, the results provide feedback to the approach that's taken. So you see that feedback loop, and that drives the learning and improvement of an organisation. Of course, that's the ideal system. What we're using this model for is to look at projects and say, okay, how do these elements display in the project we're looking at, and are there any gaps or opportunities where the project could improve for its own benefit to deliver what it's trying to achieve? And the kind of sort of quick sort of approach we use is to using these 4 words at the bottom here, thinking about the purpose of the program. So purpose, I know, would be something that Jamie talks a lot about in various webinar sessions and trainings. Are we clear about that? Does that purpose then measure up in terms of the performance we're achieving in the project. So do we assess the results in relation to purpose? And then from that, do we know how well then the processes are, the work that's being done? And then against that, how are people fitting into delivering that work? And that's the kind of the way we go about doing the evaluation. So, brief summary, the model's got 9 criteria. It also has 32 sub-criteria. We've got a whole range of materials on guidance and supporting questions for assessment, which trained assessors are briefed on and get practice in, and then use in anger, as it were, in evaluations. The whole model's focused on species, ecosystems, and landscapes. And we're interested in this flow in system dynamics, how the mechanisms of the project work, how people fit in with that. And we look at changes over time. Is there any evidence that improvements are being made over time and the project is maturing? And we try and align these human elements with the biodiversity requirements of actually delivering results that make a difference on the ground in terms of conservation. And also part of that, we're able to derive a score. There's a sort of a measure of maturity of the organisation, which you can use to compare the organisation with others. And to do that scoring, we look at results in terms of whether the measures that are being analysed in terms of results are the right ones. So are we measuring the right things? How are the trends in performance? And does the level of performance reflect changes or improvements in approach? And on the enabler side, the processes, the functioning of the project. We're looking at how good is the functioning, how systematic is the approach, is it being improved, is it informed by results over time? And those are sorts of criteria we use when we're looking at scoring. And the beauty of the scoring method is that you can use that to kind of track the maturity of the organisation. Is it moving forward? Is it becoming a better, more effective organisation over time, both in terms of results it's achieving, but also its approach and its potential sustainability in delivering results in the future. We can give a score out of 1,000, and the best of the best organisations across the globe would be getting somewhere around 800 points on that scale of 1,000. So 8 out of 10 is about as good as it gets. And world-class organisations, these are the ones that we know. The top brand organisations, top performing organisations, would be getting probably around 750 points, and less mature organisations going down the scale, as you'll see there. In our experience, the best conservation organisations, whether that's a specific project or a programme or an NGO, for example, they'd be getting around about 600 points. So as a sector, we're not as mature as certain other sectors, and we kind of intuitively expect that. But what we're able to tell organisations that have the evaluation is that if they're getting a score of around 300, they're kind of at a sound, steady state, sort of got a grounding there, a foundation that can enable them to move forward successfully as an organisation. If they're scoring around 500 points, they consider that as a really good score, because it shows that they are open to and seeking out improvement and ongoing increases in impact. So that's a quite good sort of benchmarks, if you like, along the way, road to improvement. Typical early projects, 2, 5, 8 year projects, very often score under 300, around the sort of 250, 275 marks.
Simon?
Now we go. Yes, Jamie.
I have a question, and I'm just going to check in the chat as well, because there is some text there, and I wanted to see if that's a particular question. But I've been interested. Why have a score out of 10 if you can really only get 8? Why go up to that sort of that 1,000 mark if one can't imagine getting there, or is it not impossible to get up to there?
I think because the scoring system is split across 9 criteria, so you could, for example, score 100% on leadership, for example, and then not be scoring it on the other areas. So it doesn't prevent you from really pushing right up to the limits. And theoretically, yeah, of course you can get up to 1,000. If you score top top end on every single criteria, you'd be up at 1,000. And what we find is that obviously context changes, and we'll look at this a little bit later on. Context changes for organisations, and they need to adapt, and they might adapt, might mean taking some backward steps. Situations changes, management teams change, or threat status changes, and you can be pushed back quite a bit. So it's quite a fluid, sort of dynamic situation often. But there's no reason why the best organisations in the world couldn't push through to the ceiling towards 1,000 at all.
And thanks. And then Bex was asking, is this suggesting that 2 years, 3 years, 8-year projects would automatically score lower in the system? Is time a requirement for you to sort of move up the scale?
Very often, yeah. I mean, what we're interested in is cycles of time, particularly on results. So if you have if you're a tortoise, I always give an example of tortoise program, and you're a tortoise breeding program, and you want to show sustained success in your breeding program. That's going to take quite a long time, because the number of generations for you to be pumping out new population of tortoises is going to take you a long time. If you're working with other species that have much quicker cycles, or you're really neat and you can accelerate your cycles of improvement, by particular techniques, then you might find some of those results move forward and accelerate rapidly. So, but in terms of sort of sustainability, we tend to look at 5 cycles for you to start to be moving up towards the 500 points on the results side of things. That's just said, and we'll give some examples a little bit later. The best organisations that are most open to learning find they get a first assessment, then they reevaluate what they're doing, and you find they shift their focus, get much better results much more quickly, and move up the scale quite quickly. So this is just a guideline, just to give, it's sort of kind of no surprises. If a project comes to me and they've only been running for 2 or 3 years, they couldn't expect to be up at 500 points. It'd be very, very unlikely, unless they were working with, I don't know, something like amphibians, and they can have massive effect very, very quickly.
So this is related to, obviously, not just having, it's because of that biodiversity result element to it. And as you said before, about linking with biology, ecology, life history of the thing that you care about, and these things often, though not always, will take time to sort of filter through, even if you're doing the greatest work.
Yeah, absolutely. But as I said, that's not to say that organisations can't improve significantly. We'll look at some improvement scores a little bit later on, which may sort of give a bit of insight to that question.
Thanks.
Okay, so I'll move forward, but keep coming in with your questions along the way, folks, and we'll try and keep to time. So in terms of method, just so very, very brief overview of how we do it. There's a number of kind of core approaches we use, which look very similar. A third-party method is one where you are the project, and we get together a team of independent assessors, and they worked independently as third parties. So they do a document review of your organisation, get everything off you they can, and then they'll do a site visit. So one or more assessors will do the site visit. They'll look at your locations, they'll meet your teams, they'll look at the work, they'll pull through any results that you have in the field or in your offices that you can't send online, and they'll speak to stakeholders and get a sense of all the issues that they haven't been able to dig out in the previous document review. And from that, they'll produce a position document, which is kind of a report of what you do in terms of against the 9 criteria of the model. And then the assessor groups, each individual assessor assesses that, and then they come together for an assessment meeting where they share their views and ideas and generate feedback for the project. So a fairly sort of thorough hands-on site visit approach. We have used another method which is more partnering with the project team. So document review is sort of shared. There's some shared data collection. So the team themselves might do some of the interviews or issue questionnaires, or support the running of focus groups on particular areas of question. They might do that in partnership with the assessors. And then the rest of the process is fairly similar, with a position document and an assessment meeting with the trained assessors. And then we've used this in the past, but obviously in the last year or so, this has become much more important as a remote method where we do the entire document review and the interviews online, focus groups online, questionnaires and so on, completely remotely. That then generates the position document, and we conduct the assessment remotely. And we can apply sort of any of these different combination of these things depending on the circumstances of the program, of the project, how big it is, where it's located, how spread out it is, etc. And we will design that in partnership with the project to make sure it's as effective and non-intrusive as possible. There is a fourth method which I'd like to introduce, and I've used in other sectors, which is self-assessment. So that's where the project actually goes through this whole process themselves. So they're familiar with what they need to collect, and they're just doing a self-learning exercise and evaluating themselves. But I think we're some way off that yet, but that's certainly an ambition to do that. We have done sort of part self-assessment in parallel with a third-party assessment, and this just kind of illustrates some of the things that come out of it. What we found is that areas around conservation processes, understanding that is quite a challenge. These are scores here, and the black lines show you the scores of the local team, the staff members, and you can see that they've scored very, very high in this case for core conservation processes. So they think they're really good, but actually the external assessor trained and got strong understanding of process is scoring them significantly lower on that criteria. Okay, so that's just where the expert has got more insight and more understanding and more able to critique what's going on. And we found in this case again, resources and partnership, again, people tend to overrate themselves on that, and that's not surprising. Resources and processes very much interlinked. And policy and strategy and leadership, people tend to overrate themselves or their colleagues or their own organisation's approach a little bit too much. And so I don't think those are surprising areas where we think we probably wouldn't know, we wouldn't be as expert at doing that ourselves, and we need independent experts to do it. So that's just an illustration to show you, where our understanding of the importance of an external reviewer is important. We do have a whole range of reviewers. Our assessors are spread right across the globe there. You can see if we've got anyone in the webinar from South Asia, Central Africa, Australia, New Zealand, you can see we're sort of low on numbers in those areas. So feel free to get in touch with me if you're interested in becoming an assessor, and we'd be pleased to hear from you. The range of programs that we've assessed recently, from the 32 recent ones, you can see they're spread right across the globe. I'll show you the map a little bit later. But there are also very different types of organisation as well. So species conservation, reintroduction, community conservation, rescue, rehabilitation, release, protected areas, big international global programs, national programs, specific NGOs wanting the whole NGO examined, zoos we have, and so on. The focus on each of those is fairly spread out as well. Landscape, species focus, community conservation, islands, and then, as I said, some organisations wanting whole organisation assessment. And we've got these organisations spread literally right across the globe, as you can see there. Okay, I'm just checking questions, and we'll keep moving on. So I have a discussion really of the value of assessing operations. So this is looking at the function of projects, the processes that occur, as well as looking at the results. I'll try and give you some insights that the CEM allows us to explore. Now, kind of conceptually, in conservation science, we often talk about outcomes and results. We talk about stochastic events and deterministic events, and how they affect our conservation work, and whether we consider those in terms of results, outcomes, and so on. But in terms of managing, we need to kind of get down to more specific understanding of how results arise and what our management work is having an impact and effect upon. I mean, we can have natural variation, where stuff gets sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes up, sometimes down. Natural mortality would be a classic example of that, a result that goes up and down, variation naturally. Secondly, there's exceptions. There's the one-off events. Suddenly this happened. Is that because we've done anything? No, it's just a one-off exception. Like captive breeding turtles suddenly breeding successfully in an outdoor pond. It's just a one-off event. We can have chance itself. The kind of pure luck thing that goes on. And I think of the black-footed ferret example in '81. When they thought it was all extinct, and then suddenly a dog brought a dead animal up onto the porch. And suddenly they realised that there must be some animals out there. That was just pure luck. The dog happened to plop it onto a porch of someone who had a vague interest in ferrets. If it happened anywhere else, nothing would have happened about in terms of black-footed ferret recovery. Lucky luck, slightly different. This is kind of lucky luck does come from sort of organisation development theory. Okay, so this is where you actually go out to find your own luck, if you like. So you might have tales about strange animals, and that might inspire you to go out to look for that type of animal. And when you go out and look for the animal, you find out it's a tree kangaroo. It's a new species that's been discovered. That's lucky luck. You were lucky to find it, but it was because you were going out there deliberately, purposefully to do it. And then we get another result, which is about predictable achievement, where we're saying, okay, we've got a method, we're doing this, we're managing what we're doing here, and we're aiming to get particular results. So if we're doing, we're managing breeding pairs of birds, we're giving them supplementary feeding in the wild, we can make some prediction of the number of fledglings that will occur from their hatched nests. And then there's the direct planned outcome, which is more the sort of project deliverable. We do this activity, it delivers this outcome. We put all these materials together, we build it, and it becomes a wall. Now, obviously, these last ones, 4, 5, and 6, are about management, about what we do. And when we think in conservation about what we do, we kind of have a few terms that we bounce around. And the conservation excellence model is trying to help us to put more concrete on those terms, actually understand what is going on and what's effective. So often we think about, okay, well, what works? We'll use trial and error, see what works, what doesn't work, and jog along until we get a method that works. But that's okay. But actually, we need to have results that link to method. And that's the sort of evidence-based approach, which we're getting much better about talking about in conservation. We apply a method, it's achieving results. Therefore, we know we've got some achievability. But more than that, we need to actually say, well, how do the results inform a choice of method from maybe options or a change of method? That's adaptive management. But we need to go further than that. We need to actually think about results prompting improvement in methods, and that's learning. And this is the area where we're just starting to get into in terms of conservation management. But I think we need to go beyond even that. We need to say, do our results enable us to renew what we're doing, actually completely change if necessary what we're doing? That sort of purposeful conservation approach. So our evaluation needs to be able to dig into those elements and see if the project is actually doing the work in the right way. And I'll give you a few examples here. I won't labour through all of them, but some great examples. These are live examples, and they might seem on the face of it fairly obvious, but I'll state them anyway because this is real stuff that's happening. So one case here, rats being removed from islands, and then snakes, rare snake population recovering because of that. But then visitors to the islands having a fear of snakes, so deliberately reintroducing rats to reduce the number of snakes. This is kind of strange stuff you wouldn't think you'd encounter. And that's got to drive, well, do we just keep doing loads and loads of rat removal, or do we do something else? And clearly you've got to do something else. We've got to get into targeted awareness activities around fear and around value for snakes with local people who travel to these locations to change their behaviour rather than us ending up with this problem here. Another one here, monitoring threatened habitat. It stops when the specialist leaves the country, and although there are volunteers there to do the work, they can't cover all the monitoring responsibilities. They've got other things in life. Well, okay, what do we do about that? Well, fundamentally, we've got to get down to hiring local people into the jobs of monitoring, or getting local contractors who can come much more frequently, rather than having these overseas specialists coming and going. And then this last one, you think might be blooming obvious, but I've spoken to mature organisations saying, "What's the purpose of your organisation?" And they said, "That's a very interesting question. We never thought about that." If you get an organisation to think about its purpose properly, it should then be able to devise clear statements of objectives, work out job descriptions, make sure people are very clear on their responsibilities, and it starts very, very quickly to filling in any gaps in terms of your approach. A few others here. There's another one here. New habitats identified which are outside the species program priorities. And what they did in that case was they straight away, they could see these habitats were relevant to the purpose of their program, and they absorbed them into their objectives, just revised their objectives, got some new funding fairly quickly to kickstart some work in those areas, and they acquired that funding and pressed on with the work. That's no areas for improvement there. That's the way you should be doing it. It's a highly adaptive approach. Okay, and then the last one here, ambitious species reintroduction. Okay, really complex captive breeding, habitat recovery, ecosystem re-engineering, but the habitat at last stages wasn't recovered because there were complaints from dog walkers that they couldn't put up with the management methods that were being used in that location. So the public protest, it stopped the work, stopped the entire project from growing. And the reason for that was they didn't have a public engagement process at all. I hadn't thought of that as being part of the work of the project. So they had to then devise one to say, okay, well, what do you do to engage land users and specifically dog walkers? And this is a very small number of people who stopped a significant reintroduction program just because they were annoyed. Okay, so I've got a couple of cases here and going into a bit more detail, which I'll briefly go through before moving on, so I'm aware of time. So this was a case study in Asia, so it's a small subsidiary, and it was considered a bit of a rogue project. It had gone a bit off message or off grid, or it might even be a bit obsolete. It was just ticking away in the background. Now, this wasn't something that the assessor team was aware of at the time. And when they did the assessment, they identified this small NGO actually had excellent leadership. It was extremely efficient, value for money operation, had a very, very strong reputation, really important key partnerships, and excellent people management. And taking that back to the funding body, they were surprised and shocked, because they thought it was a basket case. The problem was that funding body was looking for the wrong things in this project, and they could have thrown out a very successful project completely unnecessarily and harm themselves. Actually, this project is now a role model program, and has some international standing now. So it's, I'm just trying to emphasize there how using the CEM enabled us to evaluate and look at the right things and see the true strengths of this program, rather than using the wrong sort of set of eyes which had been previously used. Okay, another one here in Central America, small NGO again, that had needing to improve its leadership, and this is basically not having the right people in the right roles. Okay, so they didn't hire local people. There was an unsustainable approach. Landscapes were left when role holders on short-term contract left, and then the landscapes were degraded during that fallow period, and local people couldn't, who were just volunteers, couldn't kind of keep up with the work. What they needed to change there was to actually take ownership of the roles and bring those roles into their local NGO, and hire people locally, and develop them professionally locally, so that the work could be done and could be owned, and people would do it as a job, rather than having expensive international staff come in. So that organisation change made an impact in terms of the reduction of threat and the maintenance of that ecology. So we need to be aware, that results will always lag approach. So whatever we do, results will probably follow on later. So that's one reason why we need to look at the approach that's taken as well as look at the results, because sometimes the results won't come out until later on. And the conservation excellence model looks at all of those things and makes sure that we're not missing any tricks on it. We can come back to these on questions a bit later on. What's worth saying is that if you look at the age of a program, and we were talking about age earlier, age doesn't necessarily equate to excellence. So we've got a range of programs here from protected area, it's been around for 40 years. Not having a total score there, this is built up from all the criteria, much different to organisations which are much, much younger. So you've got down towards the bottom there an organisation of under 10 years old with a pretty high score that exceeds those of much older programs. So we need to be aware of that. It's not just how long it's stuck around for, whether it's good. It's about whether it's learning, improving, moving forward, being more relevant, ensuring relevant results are achieved. So this sort of value of learning and how the CEM can make a difference to kind of encourage organisations to learn and improve the projects is really important. And the feedback that we give to a project is really specific to the programme. It looks at what needs to be improved to address the context that the program's in, and it's not about ticking boxes to achieve things in the 9 criteria. Okay, you're not going to get feedback that says to improve against the leadership criteria you need to. It's not going to happen. We're going to give feedback that enables the project to improve itself, to deliver what it's there to do. We've got good assessors who can make recommendations that really do address many aspects of the model, but are particularly useful points of intervention that will make a difference. So we've got a few organisations here who've been reassessed, and you can see the years when they've been assessed and then reassessed. This first one here, assessed in 2018, and then in 2021, improvements in leadership, improvements in policy and strategy, and improvement in biodiversity results, driving an overall improvement score. The middle one, slightly interesting, has a lower score in 2020 than it did in 2015. The reason for this is changes in performance in terms of processes, you see in the red there, and in biodiversity results. And the reason for that is that the project, having been successful in terms of delivering recovery of a species, then had challenges in terms of that species in its landscape. So the context had changed, the scope of the project had changed, the need for the project to address issues around community and around landscape recovery and all these elements suddenly came into play, and the results challenge of the project is that much larger. But you will see here that actually it's also started to address engagement of the people and community, so it's starting to make improvements there. So there's a basis now then for that project to improve in the future, which I'm sure we'll see it do. So that change in context is reflected in the change in the score profile. And then at the bottom here we've got a program that's moved very quickly from 2014 to 2017 by systematically improving its policy and strategy, its people and community management, and its resource management, and sort of funding success driving work and delivering better results. So quite significant improvement, and that organisation I'd expect to see becoming a role model organisation in the coming years, so watch this space. Okay, so there are some lessons learned. I'm aware of time, so I'll sort of take us through this and see if there's some questions at the end. But key lessons learned that relate to project planning. I've got the SG species conservation planning steps there on the right hand side just to refer to, but I think the key things that we really need to consider in evaluation is firstly purpose, vision, goals, scope, and how those are aligned. And I know this is something that Jamie talks about a lot. That's something that comes through in CEM evaluations. But secondly, more importantly, is this core processes, how conservation work processes are designed in terms of their purpose, activity, and flow, and how they're improved. That's really not very well understood in conservation. That's something we really need to learn how to do better in terms of the design of projects. Operational plans important. People plans, again, how roles are designed and fit, how we include local hires within organisations where that's relevant, how we develop people, how we develop capacity over time, how we incorporate volunteers. These are really crucial things that organisations often fall down on. Financial planning, really important. Funding cycles, targeted effort, purposeful funding plans. A key thing that often comes out. Results we know a lot about, and then this final aspect of learning and renewal, and how we learn and renew in the context of changes in the demands, the threats, the context, the economics and social climate that we're working in. Really, really important. So typically CEM brings out whether in reality the plans, the conservation plans that we've got in place are based on science, whether they're actually used to drive work priorities, whether they have the input of all the relevant stakeholders, whether they're adhered to, whether they're just a document that sits on the shelf, or whether they're actually used, whether they're adaptive, whether they change according to context, whether staff or stakeholders can actually raise questions or challenge what's included in the plan, and whether they're responsive to failure and learning, whether they're updated as a result, and obviously whether they fit to funding cycles, and ultimately whether those plans are successful in delivering what they aim to achieve. So issues around short-term projects versus long-term change is noted in evaluation, really important. Project design, obviously fitting to a clear purpose. This idea of evaluating purpose, performance, process and people is really key, and the engagement of local people in that process, including local hires, is really important to drive sustainability. So there's a number of sort of key learning points, but I think the key thing is that the practices that we encourage people to explore in their projects are about relating what they know to be good or learn to be good elsewhere, but applying them in the ways that are meaningful in the context that they are working in. And it doesn't have to be high cost, high value. We found low budget projects that really have some world-class work going on, and outstanding management that occurs in quite unlikely places. And that the pace of transformation, change and improvement can be really, really quick. It doesn't have to be years and decades. It actually can be done in months and years. And I think also the way we manage people in projects is around dignity rather than bureaucracy. So the way we put people management processes in place is really important. And as I said, learning will enable us to achieve much, much more. So hopefully you've seen that the CEM evaluates a whole range of issues in a project or in a program. It's all about improvement and learning. It's all about driving organisational learning thereafter. And it's also part of a leadership process. The project leaders are prepared to open up to this process. That's a sign that they're really committed and interested in improving their own project. And also it fits with the ecosystems and species of concern. And hopefully you get a sense there that we'll start to understand what good conservation really looks like. So thanks very much. I've got a few colleagues there I mentioned on the way through who've worked with me a lot on this, and there are also many unnamed because I've anonymised them in the work so far. Thanks very much. Any questions? Have you got a minute or two for that, Jamie?
Thank you very much, Simon. That's a fantastic overview. Time for a couple of questions. Alex is asking about in the chat around, how as managers we can kind of build strong evidence of the outcomes of conservation projects, so that we don't just use chance or unintended results. So I suppose it's and I sort of had a related question around the difference between kind of adaptive management, which I always thought was, well, you are recognizing that what you were trying to do either didn't work or the system has changed, and so what you were going to do wasn't going to work, so you're going to do something else, which I thought was sort of equating to learning, but not how you've laid it out. So what would your sort of, in a nutshell, kind of recommendation be to sort of managers on the ground to most effectively build evidence that's most relevant to the work they're doing?
I think you've got to try out methods, and then have decent metrics measuring what you've achieved, and collect that evidence kind of quickly and in small way. And then if it works, build it up, increase the scale, and keep measuring. And if it's still proving to work, then build it up and build it up. And if along the way you find there's a problem, then you need to adapt and change the method again. This is kind of experimental sort of innovation cycle approach that's going to allow you to work and improve much more easily. And what you're doing is you're looking at the results to see if your method's working, and then you're improving your method or changing it, seeing if it's worked. If it has worked, carry on. If it hasn't worked, step back a bit, think again, and then devise another method. You don't necessarily do that for the whole program all in one go. You do it in small ways at low cost, and that will enable you to make improvements and then start bedding them in, scaling them up when you know they're really established and they work properly.
Thank you very much, Simon. So if you've got any other questions, I appreciate it's just after the hour, so we are going to wrap up shortly. But if there's one more question anybody wants to put into the chat, as you think about that, Simon, well, I suppose for people who are involved, like I am around helping others to plan for their projects, there'll be multiple ways I could see this as being valuable in the conversations I might have with people, particularly around roles, which is something that comes out quite strongly around clarity of roles, both within the planning of a project and then in the implementation of that project, roles and responsibilities. But also I can see where you're being asked to come in and help a project to develop a new plan, i.e. it has some history, that you could imagine asking more sort of deeper questions to kind of in that preparing to plan stage to understand a better, to learn as much as one can from what happened before, and whether that's to do with how people were organized within the project, or the connection with the work, or clarity of purpose, or whatever it might be, trying to kind of get to grips with that when you're coming back in to develop a new plan could really help inform how you design a planning process that perhaps accommodates some of these important discussions that need to go on for the next time. Does that make sense?
Yep.
I don't know if I'm it makes sense to you, Simon. That's good. So Jamie is asking, as a conservation excellent model has developed and been applied to more and more organizations, will it get to a point where organizations promote their model results because it's more recognized a business excellence rating? So this is, something I know you've impressed on me quite a lot, Simon, before around the value of benchmarking, which is not to say we're better than other projects, but to get a sense of how could we improve? If they were able to do this aspect as well as they did, or as efficiently as they did, and we did it this way, what can we learn from them in order to improve how we do things? But is benchmarking something you can imagine being the case, becoming more the norm?
Yeah, very much so. I think as a sector, we're not brilliant at sharing successes. We're not good at sharing failures either. But I think that the organisations that learn to do that, and as they get confidence that they've been through an assessment and they're getting improvements from it, we will encourage them to share that, and people can then look at, okay, what are good organisations doing? What are good projects doing? What can we learn from them? And build that networking as well. And I think when we can start to see organisations that are rating very, very high on leadership, for example, then we'll start to recognise leaders who are doing good stuff. I've done assessments of organisations and identified leaders who are really, really highly effective, but they never realised they were any good as leaders. And this is a problem. We need to be much more aware of what we're good at and what we need to improve, because then we're in a position to share that with other people, and hopefully over the coming years we'll start to see that much more in our sector, where people are sharing what they're good at because they know they're good at it and they know what they've learned from it, and they'll be hopefully happy to share that, because at the end of the day we're all in it together and wanting to improve things for biodiversity together.
Fantastic, Simon. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for staying with us. We will wrap it up there. And I've put in the chat the link to, or the citation for the paper where the model was first put forward. So please go and have a look at that. Simon's got his email address there if you want to contact him to speak more about this. And I wish everyone the best. We will be talking about next month's webinar, which I'm just finalizing just now. Later on, it will be out in the CPSG, whatever it is, the news update. And if you're not on that, then you can get registered on our website to find out more about the webinar series and also other resources that are available through CPSG. But Simon, thank you so much for giving up your time with us. What is a fantastic model. Now got some history behind it now, and some been road tested, which is wonderful. And I look forward to hearing about when there's going to be a mini CEM conference where organizations will get together and share some of their thinking, where others could come in and learn from the benefits that it has brought.
Look forward to making it happen, Jamie. Thanks very much for your invite. Thanks very much.
All right, cheers. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.